Hello everybody, my name's Tom Pettit. Glad to be with you today. Hey, tonight we are talking about Emma Smith and I'm super excited. She is one of my heroes of the Restoration. Now there's a lot of characters that comprise the Restoration. We've got so many men and women who have done such wonderful things, but Emma Smith is one of my favorites. She's top of the list, or very near the top of the list of my all-time favorites of all the stories of the Restoration. When I advertised this, or at least announced that I was going to be doing this video on Facebook, I was shocked at how much negative feedback I was getting in the comments, how many people were saying negative things about Emma, and how they were saying just how she did this and did that, and they're really bad-mouthing her. And you know, I figured after 150 years since her death, or about 150 years, that, you know, the church has kind of gotten over that, but a lot of people haven't. There's still a lot of negativity out there about Emma, and I hope that tonight, one of the main purposes I have is to dispel some of that negative feeling about Emma and tell the stories about the real Emma. Not the critical throwing stones at Emma type of attitude, but the stories. I'll tell you the historic stories. They're documented, well documented. They're true stories. And, you know, in a few minutes here, after I tell a few of the stories, maybe you'll decide for yourself what kind of woman Emma was. But having studied her in conjunction with church history in a whole, she's one of my favorites. And I am going to show you through some wonderful stories tonight that she was not a hero, but perhaps the hero of the Restoration. I think that Joseph couldn't have been Joseph, the prophet of the Restoration, without good Emma by his side. And let me share with you a couple of stories to help illustrate that. I'll take you back before Joseph and Emma married. In fact, even before they met. And that was 1823. September 21st, the night going into the 22nd of 1823. This is September 21st into 22nd, 1823. This is 3 years after the first vision. And Joseph is in his room. And he's praying to know his standing with God. The heavens have been quiet for 3 years. And he thought that he was going to be receiving further instruction. So he was praying to know if he had lost his standing with God. And the angel Moroni appears to Joseph. He calls him by name. He says, "My name is Moroni. I've been sent from the presence of God." And he goes on through the whole night and the following morning telling him about a lot of things. About the Book of Mormon that was coming forth. Talks about the second coming, and it talks a lot about the blessings that are found in the temple. Well, Joseph heads to the hill the next day as directed by the angel, and he goes up and he opens up the box and he looks in and he sees the plates, but he's forbidden to take them. The angel Moroni continues to teach him and says, "Come back a year from now." The following September, Joseph goes, he pulls back the rock, looks in and sees the plates, and this time he tries to take them out. But he gets shocked. He can't take them out. And he says, "Why can't I obtain the plates?" And Moroni says, "You haven't been faithful yet. Come back. Let's try this again the next year." So Joseph comes back the next year. He pulls the plates out. He sets them next to him. Doesn't get shocked. But he reaches in for the other items that are in the box. And when he turns around, the plates are gone. So he starts to get scared, a little nervous. Angel Moroni comes back and says, "You weren't faithful in being obedient to the commandments of God. You can't have the plates this year either." Well, Joseph says, "Well, when can I obtain the plates?" And this is what Moroni tells him. He says, "You can obtain the plates 1 year from now if you bring the right person with you." See, up to this point, Joseph had gone to the hill Cumorah by himself. But the angel says, "You can have the plates a year from now if you bring the right person with you. And if you don't bring the right person with you, you'll be cut off and you'll never obtain the plates." Now, did you know that part of the story? It's true that Joseph was told, if you don't bring the right person, you're cut off. The Lord will raise up somebody else, essentially. Well, Joseph didn't know what to do other than try to be as obedient as he could to the commandments of the Lord. And he was faithful in keeping the commandments of the Lord. But during that year, while he was waiting for the following September, he was working as hard as he could to help mom and dad pay the mortgage on the farm. See, a lot of people say, well, Joseph had a third grade education. That's true. He only went to school until he was in third grade because at that point he was big enough and strong enough to help mom and dad on the farm and doing odd jobs in order to help pay the mortgage. So he was picking up odd jobs as he could. One of these jobs was offered to him down in Colesville, New York, right on the border of New York and Pennsylvania. A man by the name of Josiah Stoll hired Joseph and Joseph Sr. to come down to Colesville and help him out with a project. Well, while he was down there in Colesville, Joseph Jr. and Joseph Sr., while they were there, they room and boarded with an individual who was friends with Josiah Stoll. This man's name was Isaac Hale. He lived just over the border in Pennsylvania in a little town called Harmony, Pennsylvania. Well, Isaac Hale brought Joseph in. He did the room and board thing as agreed per the employment agreement. Isaac Hale had a beautiful daughter in her early 20s, and of course, she and Joseph caught each other's eyes. The daughter of Isaac Hale was none other than Emma Hale. This is how and when and where Joseph and Emma would meet. Well, Joseph and Emma courted as best they could while Joseph was there laboring with Josiah Stoll, but they soon found that they were in love with each other and they desired to get married. Now, the stories about angels and gold Bibles and such had followed Joseph wherever he went. So Isaac Hale knew these stories, and for that, he didn't like Joseph at all. So in response to Joseph's, the attention Joseph was giving to his daughter, Isaac did not want anything to do with this courtship. He forbade it. However, love knows no bounds, right? Or boundaries, or wooden fences, or block walls that fathers put up, perhaps, at least in this case. And Emma decided that she still wanted to marry Joseph. Now think about this for a moment. Isaac knows about the stories that Joseph has about angels and whatnot. Therefore, Emma does too. Emma knows the stories about the angel, about a book that's deposited that nobody has seen except Joseph. And yet she's still interested. She still stays by Joseph, even in the forbidding of her father that they get married. Now, the documents say, the records say that Isaac told Emma and Joseph, "You're not getting married in this house," which was customary of the day for the daughters to be married in their family home. And so they couldn't have the wedding in the house. Well, Joseph and Emma interpreted, maybe stretching it, absolutely stretching it, in thinking that, well, Isaac says you can't get married in this house. That doesn't mean we can't get married. Well, that wasn't the intent of Isaac, but they found the loophole in his statement. And sure enough, they headed up the road to South Bainbridge and got married by the Justice of the Peace. They eloped. Just the two of them, and the Justice were the entire wedding party. Well, now that they're married, they can't go back to Harmony because now Isaac he never liked Joseph, and now he's kind of upset with his daughter about getting married. And so the only place they have to go is to the Smith family farm and move in with Joseph's parents and siblings. So fresh off the honeymoon, Emma and her new husband move in, and now Emma's living with her mother and father-in-law and a few of her in-law brother and sister-in-laws as well. Now let's hold off on the story here for a second and let's examine what's really going on. Isaac Hale was incredibly wealthy, very wealthy, and one of the wealthiest men in New England probably. And as Emma, the oldest and only daughter, she was set to inherit a lot of it, if not all of it. So she was set up financially for the rest of her life. Prior to meeting Joseph, she was the most well-educated woman, maybe in all of New England as well, at least the surrounding area. Very well educated. She had skills, she had talents, she had abilities. She could sing like a songbird. She was very popular with everybody in town, especially the young men who were also well educated, well liked, well respected, and on their way to financial greatness. Joseph is absolutely the opposite. As I just mentioned, he had a third grade education. His talent was digging wells and chopping down trees. He had no financial prospect, and everybody in town hated his guts. This was just the opposite of the life that Isaac Hale had set up for Emma everything that was available to her. So what set Joseph apart? Why was Emma willing to give up her friendships, her relationships with her family, and all this money, education, and every opportunity that this life could afford her for nothing? Everything in opposite of that. She's moving in with her in-laws. She has no prospect of money. She has no prospect of making friends because her husband is disliked by everybody in town. So what gives? What was it? I speculate this. Her testimony. She knew the stories about the angel, about the book that was still in the hill. Not a single character had been translated yet. And she believed it to be true. She had a testimony that Joseph Smith was the prophet of the restoration. She had a testimony that a restoration was taking place, that the Church of Jesus Christ was being restored to fulfill ancient prophecy and to provide every blessing, earthly and heavenly, that a loving Heavenly Father could provide, but it would only be found in this restored church. She had a deep, unwavering testimony of that. And for that reason, she followed Joseph and gave up everything else. Now this starts off Emma, our story of Emma, and why I like her so much. You get a little bit of an understanding of her background. Now she's going to get thrust into the story of the restoration. Joseph returns to the hill, September 21st, going into the morning of 22nd, 1827. And do you remember what I told you Moroni said to Joseph? If you don't bring the right person with you, you're cut off. Well, from the history of Mother Smith, we learn the rest of this part of the story. It was about midnight, Mother Smith said, and she was in the kitchen area of the home. If you've been to the home there at the Smith family farm, it's the white frame home. She's there in that kitchen area. And from the stairs comes Joseph, dressed, doesn't say a word to his mom, walks through the room, out the front door, and starts to hitch up the horse and wagon. The horse and wagon belonging to Joseph Knight, who was visiting from Colesville. They were too poor to have a horse and wagon. But he hitches up the horse and wagon. And Lucy in her journal says that she didn't think much of it until she saw Emma come down the stairs, through the room, not saying a word to her mother-in-law, out the front door and getting in the horse and buggy with her husband, Joseph. And they headed down the road, and Lucy says at that point that she knew what was going on. They were headed to the hill to get the plates. Now, the record's not clear as to whether Emma ascended the hill with Joseph or not. I think that she stayed in the wagon. But either way, she was there at the hill. Joseph came to the carriage with the plates. Now, based on the historical facts that I've given you, what do we understand about Emma? Emma was the one that the angel Moroni commanded Joseph to bring with him to the hill. So I think to myself, and you might think for yourself, why is that so important? Why did Emma have to go to the hill in fulfillment or in obedience to the commandment from the angel Moroni? What was it that was so necessary to have Emma there? This is where I speculate, because the record doesn't say it. It's just my opinion. It might become your opinion as well, or you might come up with a different opinion. But my opinion is this. Joseph could not obtain the record without Emma by his side. And when I start to think of myself, and certainly I haven't had a calling in the church as Joseph had, but whatever calling I have had, whatever sacrifice I've given in an attempt to magnify that calling, the sacrifice of my wife in allowing me the opportunity to serve has been greater. When I run off to church meetings early on a Sunday morning, it's my wife that gets 5 kids dressed and ready and to church on time. And this goes on 6 or 7 days a week, depending on the calling or whatever. But no calling that I've had, I would have been able to do to any degree of success without my good wife standing there by my side. And I think it's probably the same way with Joseph. Joseph couldn't do what Joseph did without Emma by his side. I understand that because for the last 18 years that I've been married, I've experienced that. And so I can somewhat relate to Joseph in that, yeah, I probably wouldn't have amounted to much of anything without my wife. And so I think it probably is the same could be said about Joseph, that of the things that he had to go through without Emma there, he probably wouldn't have been able to do it. And I think the good Lord knew that to be the case. And that's why the angel Moroni was giving the commandment to Joseph that, hey, there's a church to be restored, and you're the chosen prophet, but you're not going to be able to do it without Emma. That was the commandment. And now that part of it, that's not my opinion. That's the fact in the history. So Joseph, with Emma by his side, obtained the record, and he brings it out of the hill and into his possession. He's got the record, and they're still living at the Smith family farm with Emma's in-laws, Joseph's family. But the persecution becomes such that they know they've got to get out of town. Where do they go? They don't have any money. They don't have any friends. The only family they have is the Smiths living there in Palmyra, Manchester area, or the Hells down in Harmony. But Emma's dad doesn't like Joseph. Well, fortunately, Emma's father and Joseph had one thing in common, and it was probably only one thing, and that was their love for Emma. So Emma writes her dad a letter. Dad, we're having trouble up here in the Palmyra area. We need a place to live. And Isaac Hell responds, come here. Please come home to Harmony. So Joseph and Emma head down to Harmony. They live with the Hells for a little while until Joseph and Isaac were able to settle on, have an agreement, a contractual agreement to have Joseph purchase a portion of Isaac Hell's land. It ends up being 13 acres, the adjoining 13 acres to where Isaac lives. If you go to the Priesthood Restoration site today, you'll see the reconstructed Isaac Hell home, and just up the road, 50 yards or so, but across the street is the reconstructed Joseph and Emma's home, built on the original foundation, so we know exactly where they were. And so now we've got them down in Harmony. Well, down in Harmony, there's a couple of things that happen before all the things in Harmony happen. And this gives you a little bit more insight into the lives and the struggles that Joseph and Emma are going through. They get to Harmony. Emma's family does not like Joseph. It's not only Isaac, but it's also Emma's uncle. Emma's uncle is kind of the instigator of putting together the verbal mobs. And I say the verbal mobs because these mobs didn't turn to violence. They only threatened it. But Nathaniel Lewis is his name. And Nathaniel Lewis was kind of stirring up the townspeople to be anti-Joseph. So Emma here has her father against the whole idea. And now she's got her uncle who's stirring up the townspeople to turn against her and her husband. What's Emma to do? Well, Emma's pregnant with her first child. And I'm not saying the two are related, but in addition to all this grief that's going on and whatnot, coming directly from her family, she gives birth to a little boy. And within hours, that little boy passes away, their first child. They would end up bearing 5 children. This was the first that they would bury. They bury the baby. They named him Alvin after Joseph's older brother who had died about 5 years prior to this point in the story. Well, they bury the baby. In consequence of a difficult delivery, Emma gets sick, and she gets very sick. In fact, they think she's probably going to die. So she's deathly ill. Up to this point, Emma had acted as scribe for Joseph as he tried to translate the Book of Mormon. And I say try because of the time constraints. He was caring for his very pregnant, very sick wife. He was trying to thwart off his in-laws and others who were verbally attacking him. And he was trying to get a crop into the ground that he could harvest and feed his wife and soon to be born child. And so Emma was working a little bit on the translation. 2 of Emma's brothers, Reuben and Alva, a boy named Alva, and his brother, Emma's brother as well, Reuben, the 2 of them also sat and scribed for Joseph as he translated a little bit. The work was progressing very slowly. And so one of Joseph's benefactors Martin Harris. He comes down to Harmony to pay him a visit. He sees that the translation work's not able to happen, and so Martin says, I'll scribe for you, Joseph. So Joseph and Martin sit down and they get going, and they work so hard and work so fast that they're able to produce 116 pages of translated pages of the Book of Mormon. Well, you know this story. We're not going to focus on it. We're going to focus on Emma tonight. But Martin takes the pages to go show his family up in Palmyra. He's gone for too long. Emma says, Joseph, you got to go see what happened to the pages. She's very interested and very concerned. Maybe even more so than Joseph. As the story goes, you'll see. And Joseph says, I can't go. You're sick. We just buried our child. You're not well. Anyway, she persists in encouraging him to go to Palmyra to see what's going on. So he takes off to Palmyra. As the story goes, as you know, Martin Harris has lost 116 pages. Now, you know part of the story. Most people don't know the whole story. Martin comes into the house, and Joseph says, Martin, where are the 116 pages? And Martin says, I've lost them. Now, what you know is that Joseph's response was, I have lost my soul. But what's not commonly mentioned in our Sunday school lessons is that the sentence before that, so the very first thing that Joseph said to Martin upon learning that the 116 pages were these: this will kill Emma. And then he says, I have lost my soul. Now, why would he say this will kill Emma? Because of what she had sacrificed for the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. She had given everything, as I've somewhat explained, and more so than I haven't explained. She gave it all. And her desire to have that book come forth was as great as Joseph's. And she was willing to have her family leave her friends, leave the education and the job prospects and the marrying prospects and everything behind, because she had a testimony that the Book of Mormon was true, although she'd never read a single word of it yet, except for the words that she would later translate. And so Joseph's first thought was, this will kill Emma. She's given too much and now it's all gone. Well, he returns and tells Emma didn't die because of the lost 116 pages. Her response? Just start over. Joseph, you can do this. Joseph explains, no, I've lost my ability to translate. The angel has taken the Urim and Thummim from me. And she says, Joseph, you have seen an angel. You have been called of God to do this work. You will do this work. And it was her encouragement that turned Joseph to repentance. Repentance was granted. The Urim and Thummim was returned along with the plates. And the translation process would begin again with a heaven-sent scribe by the name of Oliver Cowdery. An awesome story, but it doesn't have too much to do with Emma, so we're not going to tell it tonight. So it was Emma's encouraging words of support for Joseph. Turn your attitude around and let's get back to work. This is our work. We've been called to it, and let's go get it done. What a great thing. Well, from there, the persecution becomes such that they can't stay. They've got to move again. This time, Oliver Cowdery, who I just mentioned is in Harmony, he has a friend that lives in Fayette, New York, by the name of David Whitmer. He writes David Whitmer a letter and he says, hey, I am about the work of God. These things that we've talked about in the past, it's true. I found out it's true and it's right. And it's a great thing. I'm involved in it, but we can't keep doing the work that we need to here in Harmony. Can we come to your home, to your farm, and can we finish the work there? Well, it wasn't really his farm. It was his parents' farm. If you've been there, it's called the Peter Whitmer farm, not the David Whitmer farm. So David goes to his mom and dad and says, Oliver, who they knew and trusted and liked, Oliver says that this is the work of the Lord. He wants to bring the work here. Well, the story goes through miracle upon miracle to make it happen that the work of the translation could be completed up there in Fayette. Also the location of where the church would be organized, April 6, 1830. But to stick to our story of Emma, father and mother Whitmer, Peter and Mary, say yes. The three of them can come. Joseph, Emma, and Peter. And so they come. Now, Emma, here we are again. she moves in to a small cabin with Mother and Father Whitmer, and there I believe it was 8 children, ranging in the age from David, who would have been in his mid-20s, all the way down to a toddler. She comes knowing that she's somewhat of an unwelcome guest. Now, although Peter and Mary Whitmer believe Oliver and they want to help Oliver because they like him, they don't yet have a testimony of the work. That would come later. And so they didn't like the idea that strangers were coming in to their already overcrowded home, and that they would need space to work on something that they didn't yet believe in. They were also not naive to the stories about Joseph and the troubles and the persecutions that followed him. Peter and Mary were not excited to invite them into their homes. Not only did Emma suspect it, she felt it. How could she not? Here she comes, grieving over the loss of her child that she recently buried, having said goodbye to her family perhaps for the last time, and yet moving in again with strangers as an unwelcome guest. And yet she did it. She did it because she knew that they needed to go to Fayette to complete and continue with the work that she knew to be true. Well, she moves from Fayette. The next stop is Kirtland. She moves in with the Whitneys. Now, the Whitneys were searching for truth, so Emma had that going for them, that she was a welcome guest there, but yet she was another house guest. In fact, the Smiths would move 16 times in the first 17 years of marriage. 16 times in 17 years of marriage. And it wasn't until the 7th move that they moved into a home of their own. The first 6, they were, sleeping on the couch and on the floor, and actually the Tundle bed at the Johnson home, and the spare bedroom that was very small in the Whitney store. And so they did their very best, but these are the very trying circumstances that Emma was under. Well, from Kirtland, they would move to Far West. Now, a lot of things happened in Far West. I'll jump straight to one of my most favorite Emma stories. It's one of my favorites. She's treated the worst in this story, but it's one of my favorites because of the way she responded to the situation. And here's how the story goes. You know enough of the Missouri story to know that the circumstances in Far West were dire. The Saints had been chased out of Jackson County into Clay County. The citizens in Clay County did not repeat the horrific scenes of Jackson County, but after 2 years, they said to the members of the church, "We want you out of our county." And so they had to move out. They moved to Caldwell County, where the county seat is Far West. And so all the saints from Missouri and from Kirtland came in, joined together as one body of saints in Far West. The Mormon militia, the Missouri militia, they didn't get along. There was a lot of skirmishes, a lot of fights. A few people died. And as a result, the Governor Boggs, the governor of Missouri, signs an extermination order. All the saints have got to leave. They call them Mormons, the members of the church. All the members of the church have got to leave Missouri or they'll be exterminated. Well, they had to get out of there, and they had to get out of there fast. While this is happening, Haun's Mill occurs. The survivors of Haun's Mill come into Far West. All this going on around poor Emma, and where's her fear? Her husband, of course. That's who the Missourians want. Well, the Missourians got him. Through trickery, they arrested Joseph, Hiram, Sidney, and others, and they hauled them off, and through a few different events, they ended up in Liberty Jail. Well, the man who tricked Joseph and Hiram and the others, he in a deceitful way, he misled them and took them and turned them over to the bad guys. Well, that man, he went back into town after he pulled the most rotten, most evil deed perhaps in church history in turning Joseph in unjustly through a bunch of trickery. He heads back into town and he heads straight to the Smith home. Now, of course, Joseph's on his way to liberty, and this man knows it. And he goes and knocks on the door, and of course, Emma answers. And the man was probably greeted not only by Emma, but by her 4 small children that were right around Emma's knees, having witnessed their father being dragged off to jail. Well, Emma, fearing for her husband's life, not knowing if she's ever going to see him again. And if she does, it's going to be a long time from now after he sits in a filthy dungeon. She's scared. The Missouri militia is all around, threatening to execute the extermination order and kill all the members of the church. Of course, her and her children included. She's scared out of her mind. This man, this evil man, comes and knocks on her door. She opens the door, and he says, "Your house is now my house. Get out." She only had a few moments to scramble her 4 children together and to grab whatever she could in her 2 hands and head out the door as fast as she could. It's dark. It's cold. And she knows that she's going to have to follow the saints, who are being led by Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball at this point, and they're going to have to get out of the state. Where they're going, they don't know. How far is it going to go? How far a distance is it? Who knows? And what are they going to eat? What are they going to wear? What are they going to sleep on? What are they going to sleep under? How are they going to transport themselves? Who knows? She's got 4 little kids, and she's got just a moment's worth of notice to grab anything she can. Does she grab the mementos that mean so much to her, that remind her of happier days? Does she grab warm clothes or bedding? Does she get food for her hungry children, who are now going to have to walk eventually 300 miles across frozen prairie to the Mississippi River out in the east? What is it that she grabs in just that moment? She gets her 4 kids securely set aside, and she has 1 second to leave the house. She does grab one thing. Despite of all the things that she needs, she grabs a stack of papers. She takes those papers, and eventually she'll sew pockets on the inside of her dress, and she'll hide those pages inside her dress. With the pages securely fastened and hidden beneath her dress, she would put 1 child in each arm, while having 2 toddler-sized children follow close behind her. And in that condition, she would walk 300 miles to the Mississippi River. What were the pages? The inspired translation of the Bible. The translation work that Joseph had done on the Bible that had not yet been published, and there was no second copy. So I would ask that you do this. Whenever you're reading the Bible and you see a footnote that takes you down to the bottom and it says JST, and it's referencing Joseph Smith translation, every time you read that and you get a clearer, better understanding of the gospel of Jesus Christ, when you read a JST, a Joseph Smith translation footnote, and it opens up your eyes to more clarity and more understanding of our Savior Jesus Christ and His love for us, at that moment, I think you ought to, as I ought to, say a prayer of gratitude for Emma Smith. Had it not been for her sacrifice, and the sacrifice for children, for taking nothing else, had it not been for that act, we would not have the Joseph Smith translation. And so every time we see the JST, we should remind her of the great sacrifice that Emma made so that we can be recipients of the blessings of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Let me read to you a quote. When she gets across the prairie, under the condition I just described, she writes a letter to Joseph, who's in Liberty Jail. And this is what she says in part in that letter. Was it not for the direct interposition of divine mercy, I am very sure I never should have been able to have endured the scenes of suffering that I have passed through. But I still live and am yet willing to suffer more if it is the will of kind heaven that I should. No one but God knows the reflections of my mind and the feelings of my heart when I left our house, our home, and almost all of everything that I possessed, except my little children, and took my journey out of the state of Missouri, leaving you, Joseph, shut up in that lonesome prison. She describes as well as she can the scene of suffering, quoting from her letter. And then she goes on and says, but I will suffer more if it is the will of heaven. I will suffer and do more if God asks me to do it. And God would ask her to do it. I'll tell you. They get into Quincy, Illinois. They go across the river into Quincy, Illinois, where they wait for Joseph and Hiram and the others to leave Liberty Jail, make their way there, and then they move 40 miles up the river into a little place called Commerce. They would rename it Nauvoo, and they would build a wonderful, beautiful city. And for the first time in their married life, Joseph and Emma would have some sense of peace. Now, he would get taken off to jail a few times. Of course, the cases were dismissed each time. They were used to that. And so it wasn't perfect paradise in Nauvoo, but it was pretty darn close compared to what they had been through the previous 10 years. And so life in Nauvoo was great. They had a home of their own. They first started out in what's referred to as the homestead, a nice home there on the banks of the Mississippi River. And then they would move through the intersection Kitty Corner over to what is called the mansion house. It's a big, beautiful home. And Emma would operate the back half as a hotel. So many visitors would be coming to meet with the prophet, members of the church and not members of the church. And she made a little bit of money by putting up room and board in somewhat of a hotel type of fashion. But Joseph and Emma didn't make nearly as much money as they could have, because most of those hotel rooms were occupied by saints who were just getting off the boat and arriving in Nauvoo and had no money and no place to stay. It was Emma that would take them in. It was Emma that would care for the sick when she was very sick herself. She would make people feel comfortable, make people feel welcome. She did what we are trying to do today, and that is by ministering. Everything that we know and understand ministering to be, that was Emma Smith. She was taking care of the one while taking care of them all by giving attention, specific attention to the one and looking at their needs before her own, and oftentimes taking care of others' needs before even her own family's needs, let alone her own. Well, in Nauvoo, this was her life, and she loved it. She would become the first president of the Relief Society. Years earlier, she received through her husband Doctrine and Covenants, section 25, in which she was referred to as an elect lady. This would later be defined as she would be an elect lady in that she would be chosen to serve, to preside over the women's organization. That was one of the definitions that Joseph gave for that word elect. It was a prophecy that one day that she would serve in that leadership capacity, and she served in it well, setting an example for other presidents who would follow and one day lead that organization into the largest women's organization in the world. Going back to Doctrine and Covenants 25 for a moment. This was given to Emma in Harmony. You remember the situation in Harmony. She just lost her firstborn, 116 pages, family, Nathaniel Lewis, all that story I said about 20 or so minutes ago. This is the time that she receives Doctrine and Covenants, section 25. Now she's called the elect lady. She's told to do certain things, but yet in his loving compassion, there's one word in there that the Lord uses that I highlight and that I love, and it really summarizes Emma. She's doing her very best. She's trying hard, and it seems like she just keeps getting kicked while she's down by her family. Remember this back in Harmony. She's doing the very best, and the Lord, instead of admonishing her to do this or do that or be better or rise up or magnify that, he doesn't use any of those words. In fact, the single word that he uses in a lengthier sentence, but the single word that I point out is the word continue. Continue. In other words, Emma, you're doing fine. You're doing just fine. Yeah, things aren't as perfect and bright and sunny as you'd like them to be. And yeah, you'd like to do more to further the work, but what you're doing is acceptable. So continue in good works, is what he says. And the rest of her life, she would continue in good works. She would continue in those good works the rest of her life. Let me paint the picture of the rest of her life. She has the wonderful scene and life and opportunity there in Nauvoo. And then comes the day, June 27th, 1844, the day of the martyrdom. Emma was okay with Joseph going to Carthage because he'd been to jail 37 times prior and he came home 37 times. Why would stop number 38 be any different? Because he was innocent. And because the governor of the state of Illinois, Governor Thomas Ford, had personally guaranteed Joseph's protection. Thomas Ford was in town. He was in Carthage. He met with Joseph in the jail, in the jailer's bedroom upstairs, where Joseph would eventually die on this day, June 27th, 1844. And so with that confidence, Emma was somewhat okay with Joseph going to Carthage, knowing that she fully expected him to return. Well, the morning of June 27th, 1844, Joseph, Hiram, Willard, and John awoke to find that Thomas Ford, the governor, had broken his promise. He was not in town. His protection left with him. Where was Thomas Ford the day of the martyrdom? In Nauvoo, in the mansion house, being served lunch by Emma. Emma would be out of the room for a moment, and Thomas Ford would be overheard by a man who's in the other room, the man, Porter Rockwell. He overhears Thomas Ford say, "I expect the deed has been done." Now, it hadn't been. Joseph wouldn't die until 5:17 that afternoon. It was lunchtime. But Thomas Ford, according to Porter Rockwell's account of overhearing it, Thomas Ford knew that Joseph was a dead man. And yet he had the audacity to be in his soon-to-be widow's home, having her serve him lunch. Now, I don't want to talk about the character of Thomas Ford. In fact, I don't want to give him any attention at all. But here's Emma's situation. She will receive the news hours later and know that the very man who sat at her dining table that afternoon, she had served, was responsible in part for his death. And if not responsible for his death, was responsible for the lack of protection of Joseph's life. Emma's distraught. We can't even fathom what Emma's going through, but here's the physical, tangible situation Emma's in. In the next day or two, in the parlor, perhaps that same parlor, the bodies of Joseph and Hiram would be on display. They would have a public viewing. And she would have to endure the thousands of people coming through her home, allowing them to pay their final respects. In such a situation, I would think that I would shut my doors, close the blinds, and say, I think I'll have a private ceremony here, a private viewing and a private funeral. But no, she opened up her front door to the thousands of people who would stand in line for hours on end and come through the home and wish her the best if she was there at the time, but to pay their respects to her beloved husband. Well, after the funeral and whatnot, what was she left with? She was left with 4 children and one on the way. Little David Smith would be born 5 months after the martyrdom. She was also left to care for Joseph's mother, Lucy, Emma's beloved mother-in-law. They had a great relationship. They loved each other very much. And she was left to care not only for her young children, her newborn son, but now her ailing mother, who desperately wanted to go west, but couldn't. Now, I'm not going to spend time justifying why Emma stayed in Nauvoo. But perhaps at this point, finding a little bits of fact about the situation she was in after the martyrdom, it might give you reason to come up with ideas as to why she couldn't go west. Well, we're left at our own speculations on that. But I would say this. Can you blame her? Maybe not. And I think after 150 years, I think it's time to give Emma a break. And I think it's time to start celebrating who she was and what she did and expressing gratitude for the blessings of the gospel that we have in our lives, due very much in part because of the sacrifices that Emma made during her lifetime. That's my testimony of Emma. Now, just before she passed away, which was April 30th, 1879, on February 4th of that year, so 2 months before she dies, her oldest son, Joseph Smith III, brings a newspaper reporter with him to visit his mother. He wants to have an interview, and he wants to make it official. In fact, this interview is going to be published in a newspaper. They had prepared questions, and they were ready to write down her answers, her verbal answers. And these are the questions. This is the interview. I'm just going to read part of the interview, not the whole interview to you, but I'm going to read the interview to you word for word. Now, mind you, again, this is 2 months prior to her passing away. It's 35 years after the martyrdom. She had lived longer in Nauvoo without the saints than she had lived with Joseph in any location. Her entire time with Joseph was less than the amount of time she spent alone in Nauvoo. 35 years after the martyrdom, so 33 years after Brigham Young took all the saints west. And these are the answers to the questions that Joseph Smith III and this reporter asked her. Here's the question. What's the truth of Mormonism? Emma Smith's response. I know Mormonism to be the truth, and believe the church to have been established by divine direction. I have complete faith in it. In writing for your father, speaking to Joseph III, I frequently wrote day after day, often sitting at the table close by him. He sitting with his face concentrated and dictating hour after hour with nothing between us. The question, had he not a book or manuscript from which he read or dictated to you? He had neither manuscript nor book to read from. Could he not have had, and you not know it? If he had had anything of the kind, he could not have concealed it from me. Are you sure that he had the plates at the time that you were writing for him? The plates often lay, this is her answer, now this would be in harmony. The plates often lay on the table, without any attempt of concealment, wrapped in a small linen tablecloth, which I had given him to fold them in. I once felt the plates as they thus lay on the table, tracing their outline and shape. They seemed to be pliable like thick paper, and would rustle with metallic sound when the edges were moved by the thumb, as one does sometimes thumb the edges of the book. Where did Father and Oliver Cowdery write? Oliver Cowdery and your father wrote in the room where I was at work. Now, did you know that? Imagine here. And if you've been in the room, the reconstructed room in Harmony, you know how small that room is. Joseph and Oliver busy at work at the kitchen table, and Emma at the kitchen counter just a few feet away, watching and listening to the entire translation process. Question. Could not Father have dictated the Book of Mormon to you, Oliver Cowdery, and the others who wrote for him, after having first written it, or having first read it out of some book? Emma's response. Joseph Smith, and it's interesting to note that for the first time she doesn't say your father. I think she's getting serious here at her doubting son. She uses her husband's full name. Joseph Smith could neither write nor dictate a coherent or well-worded letter, let alone dictate a book like the Book of Mormon. And though I was an active participant in the scenes that transpired and was present during the translation of the plates and had cognizance of things as they transpired, it is marvelous to me, a marvel and a wonder, as much so as to anyone else. Question. I should suppose that you would have uncovered the plates and examined them. Emma says, I did not attempt to handle the plates, other than I have told you, nor uncovered them to look at them. I was satisfied that it was the work of God, and therefore did not feel it to be necessary to do so. In other words, my testimony of the Book of Mormon is so sure and so firm that seeing the plates could not make my testimony any more certain. That's powerful. And this is 35 years after the martyrdom. So this is going 35, it's pushing 50 years since the translation of the Book of Mormon took place. Did Mr. Smith, this was another individual in the room, did Mr. Smith forbid your examining the plates? Emma says, I do not think he did. I knew that he had them and was not specially curious about them. I moved them from place to place on the table as it was necessary in doing my work. Imagine, this is kind of a funny scene here. So she never looks at them, and she says, why? I didn't need to see them. Seeing them, that's not going to give me any stronger testimony than I now have, 50 years removed from this situation. And Joseph and Oliver, they would take breaks. They'd go down to the river. They'd skip rocks. That's in the history. And while they were away and Emma needed to do her work, as she called it, there in the home, sometimes the plates were in the way. And she had to move them from this table to that table so she could keep working. So, yeah, she picked them up and moved them as she needed to. She never looked at them, didn't need to. And then the question, and now this is Joseph Smith III, and he refers to his mother. Mother, what is your belief about the authenticity or origin of the Book of Mormon? And Emma Smith says, my belief is that the Book of Mormon is of divine authenticity. I have not the slightest doubt of it. I am satisfied that no man could have dictated the writing of the manuscripts unless he was inspired. For when acting as scribe, your father would dictate to me hour after hour, and when returning after meals or after interruptions, he could at once begin where he left off, without either seeing the manuscript or having any portion of it read to him. This was a usual thing for him to do. It would have been impossible that a learned man could have done this, and for one so ignorant and unlearned as he was, it was simply impossible. The question, it has been stated sometimes that you apostatized after Father's death and joined the Methodist Church. What do you say to this? Emma says, I have been called apostate, but I have never apostatized, nor forsaken the faith I at first accepted. And although the church and the prophet and the keys and the preaching and the gospel and the temples were 2,000 miles away for 35 years, she still clung to her testimony and never let go of it. Let me close here with a quote from a woman who perhaps knew Emma better than any other woman, and perhaps with the exception of Joseph Smith, she knew Emma better than anybody else. And that was her mother-in-law, Emma's mother-in-law, Lucy Smith. And Lucy in her journal records this. I have never seen a woman in my life who would endure every species of fatigue and hardship from month to month and from year to year with that unflinching courage, zeal, and patience which she has done. For I know that which she has had to endure. She has been tossed upon the ocean of uncertainty. She has breasted the storms of persecution and buffeted the rage of men and devils, which would have borne down almost any other woman. My testimony echoes that of Lucy. Emma Smith was necessary in order to have the Church of Jesus Christ restored, if Joseph was to be the prophet. I've shared that with you from the factual history as it's recorded, but I also share that as my personal testimony and belief, and do so in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.